aid allowed Marcos's by now martial law state to prosecute the war, but it was very damaging at the same time. It was a tremendous drain on Marcos's state. And again, many books have been written about resistance to Marcos, resistance to martial law, but very little has been said about the Muslim contribution to weakening the martial law state. At one point, Marcos was spending $1 million a day to prosecute the war in the South. A massive drain on financial resources. And when all was said and done, it was not successful. He could not impose central state control in these areas, simply because it was a very porous frontier. And the Philippine Muslim, or Muslim Bangsamoro, if you like, insurgents, were getting a lot of their money and weaponry from well outside the Philippines. They were getting a lot of their weaponry from Libya, Muammar Gaddafi's Libya, who wanted to encourage Islamism abroad, or the empowerment of Muslim peoples. And they were receiving quite a bit of training in Malaysia, in Sabah province. Many of the elites in Sabah province, many political figures, are suluks, meaning essentially tausug, or indeed people from the Sulu archipelago residing in Malaysia, in Sabah province of Malaysia, which adjoins or faces the Philippine archipelago. So it was very difficult to suppress. What Marcos had to do was divide and rule. He co-opted various people he tried to isolate and attack various other people. This eventually resulted in something of a dissipation of the insurgency, but it was never entirely eradicated. And indeed, it would continue until, well until the 1990s. All right. But again, it isn't all that simple. Right? From 1976, 77, it's very clear that the MNLF, the Moro National Liberation Front that was prosecuting this insurgency, was beginning to fragment. Political rivalries were emerging from within this institution. All right? And this is going to be a problem that will bedevil peace in the southern Philippines until the present day. When discussing the MNLF, you're not talking about the Viet Minh, the Viet Cong, to say nothing of the People's Army of Vietnam. These are not deeply centralized, cohesive institutions with a sense of esprit de corps that are ideologically committed to a certain kind of vision. All right? These institutions are made up of family clans, family networks, concentrations of private familial power that don the MNLF mantle because they think it will give their power some greater legitimacy or greater calling. Follow me, don't follow my rival because I'm fighting for a Bangsamoro state. All right. Already by 1977, Hashim Salamat took out a substantial chunk of the MNLF, which by 1984, officially and formally at least, by 1984 becomes the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, the MILF. This was an organization that was more Islamist in its doctrines and its calling, but fundamentally it remained a national liberation organization at base. There are some, indeed, kind of ethnic tensions as well, because most of the MNLF leadership was Tausug from the Sulu archipelago. Most of the MILF leadership, the current leader as well, Murad Ibrahim, are Maguindanao from the Cotabato River Basin. So there is this kind of intra-Muslim ethnic tension that also manifests itself. Very soon, all of this becomes an unholy mess, to put it mildly, because of the conflict continuing for literally decades, it becomes an embedded interest for various organizations that it continue. All right? You have indeed the need of the Philippine military, the armed forces of the Philippines, to justify its budgets, to justify budget increases. Naturally, you can't increase a budget when you have no insurgencies to fight, so there was a need to kind of lengthen the insurgency as far as possible. And indeed, a number of these Muslim family clans right? You can almost think of them like the warlords of Afghanistan. I don't want to overdraw it too much, but in a more milder way, you can think of these as kin groups, clan organizations that are engaged in illicit activities, smuggling, arms dealing, and indeed by the 1980s also the drug trade. All right, they want this chaos to continue because they can profit from this chaos, and because both the MNLF and the MILF lack the institutional cohesion and structure to impose discipline on its members. Whenever there is a faction, a clan, a group of armed toughs in any one of these organizations that is dissatisfied with the present dispensation, they'll just pack up, leave, and found their own organization. All right? This is indeed what led to the rise of the Maute group, also Abu Sayyaf, but in a slightly different way. More the Maute than Abu Sayyaf. I can talk more about Abu Sayyaf if you're interested in the discussion. Right? So, by the time we get to about the year 2000, 2001, the conflict itself is much less about national liberation and much more about the distribution of power, lucrative smuggling routes, weapons deals, the drug trade, and so on and so forth. All right? It essentially becomes, to some very significant degree at least, a criminalized issue on both sides. On both sides. AFP commanders, Armed Forces of the Philippine commanders, were perfectly happy to sell weapons to whoever would pay them enough for it, and so on and so forth. So everyone is equally guilty here. All right. In 2001, of course, the United States came back as a result of the war on terror. All right. It began to embed itself within Philippine military units that were deployed mainly to the Sulu archipelago and helped them to conduct counter-terror operations. Counter-terror operations that were of a certain degree of destructiveness, but still fairly marginal to the main concerns of most Muslims. Mainly because most military operations conducted by the US were happening on the island of Basilan, all right, where Abu Sayyaf was based. And to put it bluntly, Abu Sayyaf is not very well liked by Philippine Muslims on the whole. They are essentially a kind of criminal organization with an Islamist veneer imposed on the top. Not very well liked. However, by about 2003, there was a fundamental danger that these counter-terror operations, with American assistance, would widen and encompass Maguindanao itself, and possibly even Lanao del Sur, parts of what become the autonomous region in Muslim Mindanao, right? And Hashim Salamat, the MILF leader, shortly before his death, I think he was very aware that his time was short and he needed to do something to spare at least his part of the Muslim regions from counter-terror and all that entailed, wrote directly to President George W. Bush, making a case that the MILF is fundamentally a national liberation organization. It renounces terrorism. It has nothing to do with Islamist extremism. All it wants is basically autonomy, basically the freedom to govern itself according to its own traditions and customs without a Christian Philippine state breathing down its neck at every moment in time. George W. Bush, or whoever made these decisions at that time, was convinced of this. And the United States, rather than attack the MILF, which I think would have been a catastrophe, actually began to work with the MILF and various datus and family clans that were associated with the MILF. And USAID, military advisors, diplomats of various sorts, began to make deals whereby development projects, US government funding, would be funneled into deprived areas, deprived neighborhoods, and you did begin to see some level of development. This is why American soldiers were not attacked in the southern Philippines, outside of these counter-terror operations in the Sulu archipelago. By and large, and there's been a lot of good work done on this by Patricio Abinales, who's at Hawaii, University of Hawaii, Manoa. saying essentially the Datus by and large thought the American presence is a good thing for us. Not only does it bring us money and development, which the Philippine state didn't really do, it also acts as a kind of buffer between ourselves and the Philippine army. If you have an American soldier in a village in Maguindanao, AFP soldiers would be less inclined to commit certain excesses in that village. For whatever reason, it has its own interpretation there. But nevertheless, this dissipates the violence. This is all very nice and rosy, we would like to think. But there is another side to this as well. In the 2000s, you saw the empowerment of a very ruthless warlord family clan by the government of Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, all right? The Ampatuan clan, the family of Andal Ampatuan Sr., was basically used as a middleman in the struggle for pacifying the Muslim areas, and also as a very lucrative vote bank. Indeed, I think it's been shown quite conclusively that the reason Gloria Arroyo won the 2004 election was because of the votes delivered by the Ampatuan clan in the ARMM, the autonomous region in Muslim Mindanao. And of course, she was very grateful for that, dispensing huge amounts of national patronage the Ampatuan's way, and basically making the Ampatuan family the rulers, owners, and masters of the autonomous Muslim region in Muslim Mindanao. All right, so we do see a kind of waning of the insurgency, not always for very pretty reasons, because